There is a way of shrinking that no one teaches directly, and yet almost everyone learns. A way of speaking a little softer, wanting a little less, needing a little quieter, until the body itself begins to apologize for existing at its natural size. This is not humility. It is an old, learned belief that there isn't enough room in the world for the whole of you. This is the story of where that belief comes from, and what it might mean to finally take up the space that was always yours. The instinct to shrink it happens before thought has a chance to catch it. A hand half raised, then lowered. An opinion formed, then swallowed. A laugh cut short because it came out louder than intended. Somewhere in the body, a quiet mechanism activates. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. And the instruction is always the same: make yourself smaller. This instinct rarely announces itself with drama. It shows up in small, everyday negotiations, choosing the seat closest to the door instead of the center of the room, saying, "It's fine, don't worry about it," before the sentence about what actually happened has finished forming, apologizing for taking too long to order, for asking a question twice, for having an opinion different from the one already spoken. Each of these moments seems minor in isolation. Together, they form a life lived slightly folded in on itself. What makes this pattern so quietly painful is that it often goes unnoticed by everyone except the person living it. From the outside, they may appear agreeable, easygoing, undemanding, even admirable in their apparent humility. No one sees the constant internal negotiation happening beneath the surface. Is this too much? Am I too loud right now? Is there room for what I actually think, or should I let it pass? This is the ache of feeling like too much simply by existing. Not because of anything done wrong, but because presence itself, full, unfiltered, occupying its natural size, has come to feel like a risk. The body has learned an equation, somewhere along the way, that says visibility equals danger, or at the very least, visibility equals cost. And so it works constantly, quietly, to stay just beneath the threshold where that cost might be charged. There is a particular kind of loneliness in this, being surrounded by people, even loved by them, while still feeling as though the real, full version of oneself has never quite been let into the room. Because it hasn't. Only the edited version has, the version calibrated for minimum disruption, maximum ease. The real one waits somewhere just behind it, rarely invited forward, uncertain whether it would even be welcome if it were. This is not weakness. It is not fragility. It is often, in fact, evidence of a deeply attuned nervous system, one that learned, early and thoroughly, to read a room before entering it, to sense the edges of what was acceptable before testing them. The shrinking was never irrational. It was, and often still is, a strategy, one so old and so practiced that it no longer feels like a choice at all. It feels, simply, like who they are. But it isn't who they are. It is who they learned to become, in order to stay safe in spaces that once felt too small to hold them fully. The room where smallness was learned. No child begins life believing they take up too much space. That belief is taught, not usually through cruelty, but through small, repeated signals that accumulate quietly over years. Picture a household where a parent's patience was limited, stretched thin by exhaustion, stress, or their own unresolved history. In this kind of home, a child's big feelings, the loud excitement, the frustrated tears, the insistent need to be heard, might be met not with punishment, but with a sigh, a subtle withdrawal, a flicker of visible strain crossing a tired parent's face. Nothing said directly, nothing that could be pointed to later as harm, and yet the message lands anyway, clear as anything spoken aloud. Your fullness is a burden here. Children are extraordinary interpreters of unspoken atmosphere. They do not need cruelty to learn caution. They need only enough discomfort, witnessed enough times, to recalibrate their behavior. And so, gradually, the child adjusts. They begin offering a smaller version of themselves. Quieter excitement, softer disagreement, needs mentioned only when absolutely necessary, and even then, apologetically. Sometimes this lesson comes from a household defined by someone else's largeness, a parent whose emotions filled every available room, whose moods dictated the emotional weather for everyone else. In these homes, Children often learn to shrink, not because their needs were punished directly, but because there was simply no space left for them. Survival meant taking up as little room as possible, so as not to add friction to an already overfull system. And sometimes the lesson is stranger still, learned not through scarcity, but through comparison. A sibling who was louder, more demanding, more visibly needy, absorbing whatever attention was available. The quieter child learns, by contrast, that being low need is what earns steady approval. You're never any trouble, unlike your brother. Praise, again, becomes the mechanism that cements the pattern, not obviously painful, but quietly limiting all the same. Across all these variations runs the same through line. Somewhere, a child learned that their full presence, their volume, their need, their unfiltered self, was, in some subtle way, too much for the space available. And because children do not have the option of leaving to find more spacious rooms, they do the only thing available to them. They shrink to fit the one they're in. This adaptation, so reasonable in its original context, rarely announces its expiration date. It simply continues, into friendships, into workplaces, into rooms that may, in truth, have ample space for the whole of them, because no one ever told the nervous system that the old room and its old limits no longer apply. The psychology of self-diminishment. Beneath the instinct to shrink lies a psychological logic more coherent than it first appears, one rooted deeply in the body's understanding of safety and belonging. Psychologists often describe this pattern through the lens of shame. Not shame about doing something wrong, but a more pervasive, quieter shame about being something wrong. Where guilt says I made a mistake, shame whispers something closer to my presence itself is the mistake. This distinction matters. Guilt can be corrected through action. Shame, left unaddressed, tends instead to produce avoidance, a persistent effort to minimize exposure, to stay small enough that the presumed flaw is never fully seen. This connects closely to attachment theory, which suggests that early relationships teach the nervous system what kind of self earns closeness and safety. When fullness, loud joy, big need, unfiltered opinion, was met with withdrawal or strain, the developing mind draws a durable conclusion. Closeness is conditional on containment. Love remains available, but only to a version of the self kept carefully within certain limits. Over time, this belief becomes somatic, held not just in thought, but in the body itself. Many people who live with this pattern describe a genuine physical sensation when preparing to speak up, disagree, or ask for something. A tightening in the chest, a shortness of breath, a flush of heat that arrives before any conscious decision has been made. This is the nervous system treating self-expression as a potential threat, activating the same protective mechanisms it would for any other perceived danger. Because, in its outdated internal logic, it still is one. Psychologist and researcher Brené Brown has written extensively on the connection between shame and the fear of disconnection. The belief that if enough of the real self is revealed, it will exceed what others can accept. For someone shaped by early smallness, this fear does not require ongoing evidence to persist. It only required enough early confirmation to take root, after which the belief tends to self-sustain, filtering new experiences to fit the old expectation, even in relationships that would, in fact, welcome much more. This is why intellectual reassurance, being told, "You're not too much, there's plenty of room for you here," often fails to fully land. The belief being challenged was never primarily cognitive. It was somatic, learned in the body before language, and it requires new bodily experience, repeated moments of being fully present and still met with warmth, to begin, slowly, to revise itself. The first time they stayed there is often a specific, quiet moment when the old rule first meets contradicting evidence. A moment easy to overlook, because it rarely feels significant while it's happening. Perhaps it is a disagreement voiced honestly, bracing for the usual chill of disapproval, met instead with genuine curiosity. Perhaps it is a need stated plainly, "I don't have the energy for this tonight," met not with withdrawal, but with understanding. Perhaps it is simply laughing too loudly in public, catching oneself, expecting the familiar flush of shame, and finding instead that no one flinched. No one looked away. The room simply continued, unbothered, holding the fuller version of them without visible strain. These moments are rarely dramatic, but they carry disproportionate weight, because they directly contradict a belief formed long ago and rarely challenged since. Each one becomes a small, embodied data point. Perhaps this room can hold more of me than I assumed. This is often frightening in its own quiet way. The old strategy, however limiting, has offered a reliable kind of safety, predictable, controlled, familiar. To risk taking up more space, even slightly, means risking the possibility of rejection without the buffer of having stayed small. This is the vulnerability at the heart of the turning point. Not simply speaking up once, but doing so while genuinely unsure whether it will be met with welcome or withdrawal, and choosing to find out anyway. Healing here rarely looks like sudden confidence. It looks instead like small, deliberate experiments, allowing a full sentence to be finished instead of trailing into, "but it's not a big deal." Letting an excited reaction stay at its natural volume instead of dialing it down mid-expression. Saying, "Actually, I'd prefer this," instead of deferring automatically to someone else's preference. Each experiment, repeated and survived, slowly builds a new body of evidence, one strong enough, eventually, to begin outweighing the old. This process is rarely linear. There will be relapses into old smallness, moments of instinctive shrinking even after progress has been made. This is not failure. It is simply the old pattern, still present, still occasionally in charge, not because the work hasn't mattered, but because deeply learned patterns fade slowly, in layers, rather than all at once. What matters is the accumulating pattern of staying, of being met, of discovering, again and again, that the room did not, in fact, become too small. The space that was always their smallness was never their true size. It was a costume, tailored carefully in childhood, to fit rooms that could not, for whatever reason, hold the whole of them. Rooms shaped by someone else's exhaustion, someone else's unresolved pain, someone else's limited capacity. The shrinking was never a reflection of how much space they actually deserved. It was only ever a reflection of how much space felt available at the time. Beneath that costume is someone whose voice was always meant to be heard at its natural volume, whose needs were never actually too much, only, at times, inconveniently timed for people who could not meet them, whose presence, joy, and opinions were never the problem. The room was simply too small for reasons that had very little to do with them at all. To take up space now, to speak fully, need openly, exist without constant self-editing, is not arrogance. It is not selfishness. It is, more simply, an act of returning to original size after years spent folded carefully into something smaller and more convenient. There is nothing to apologize for in this return, only an old, outdated belief to gently set down. Somewhere, still, is the version of them who never learned to shrink at all, patient, unhurried, waiting the way anything true tends to wait. Not for permission exactly, only for enough safety, finally, to stop asking whether there is room, and simply, quietly, begin to take up the space that was always theirs.